517, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, Prologue and Chapter 1. Book talk starts at 12:38.
Welcome to Craftlit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 517, Dumpy and the Slops. This episode of Craftlit is brought to you by its listeners. Many thanks and much gratefulness to all of the listeners who have gone over to patreon.com/craftlit and pledged their support to the show. We couldn't do it without you. Thank you. Well, hello. How are you? I hope you are well. I hope everyone you know is well. I hope the whole world continues to be well. We are well here in eastern Pennsylvania, but something in the air has given me the worst allergy attack I've had in years. So if I sound stuffy or snarfly or pathetic, you know why. I have used more allergy eye droppage and medicines and techniques and old wives' remedies than I have ever used before, and I am still pathetic right now. So apologies if I sound nasally or just sad. But all that aside, I have got an excellent chapter for you today. Actually, more than just a chapter. There's a little bits of extras here. Eden, our new reader, is reading for you today. I think you will very much enjoy listening to him. I have a little bio of him on the website. I also have a tip jar. Eden is an actual actor person. And as you might expect right now, Eden doesn't have any acting work to do. So if you like what you hear and you feel so inclined, please swing by craftlit.com/517 and drop a little tip in his tip jar. It would certainly make me very happy, and I'm sure it would make Eden happy too. I also have a link out to my former student, Damany, who some of you met on one of our Thursday night book chats. Damany started up a podcast, and it's called Casually Creative. The first 2 episodes are up. He's just such a great guy. So if you're looking for something else to listen to, I guarantee you will find his podcast upbeat, uplifting, and a fun and interesting listen, because he's a fun and interesting guy. Also on the show notes this week, my sister sent me a webpage called Google Earth in Wool and Satin, and a woman with a lot of talent and clearly plenty of time right now took images from Google Earth and then embroidered them. It looks like they might be 3-inch diameter hoops. They're beautiful. They're just stunning. It's the kind of embroidery I wish I could do. I suppose now is the best time for me to learn how to do it. Perhaps I should take advantage of this. I don't know. I may just go back to the cross stitch I got at Sir Walter Scott's home. I have to think about that for a little while. But either way, if you would like to look at something very, very, very pretty, the link is in the show notes. Again, craftlit.com/517. Also happening this week. Last week, previous episode, I had talked about Treasure Island that the National Theater did, and I had mentioned Jane Eyre that the National Theater did. Right now, Malvolio from 12th Night is knocking it out of the park. And by the time this goes live, the National Theater's Frankenstein will be up for a week. This is the Frankenstein I yammered on about several years ago when Thing 2 and I went to see it in a movie theater where they played a videotaped recording of the stage show. Now, we saw it with Tommy Lee Miller playing Victor and Benedict Cumberbatch playing the creature. Stupendous and spectacular. No question. It appears that the version they're going to be showing on the YouTube channel for the National Theater is the Benedict Cumberbatch as Victor and Tommy Lee Miller as the creature. I don't know what to tell you. I can't imagine it's going to stink. I just haven't seen this particular version. But the staging of it alone, I think it's Danny Boyle, actually, who directed it. The staging alone is extremely creative, very smartly done, as close to the book as you are going to get in a theatrical version, I think, because you can do things on stage that you can't really do in film. It just doesn't translate right and it looks kind of cheesy on film. But this stage recording is spectacular. I'm just so excited. I literally have have asked YouTube to send me a reminder when this sucker goes live. I am that excited about it. So the day this podcast airs, you should be able to get it, at least for a week thereafter, that night and a week thereafter. Also, I've been getting questions on how to join in on the Tuesday or Thursday book chats and share what you're working on. Zoom meetings, I guess. I don't even know what to call them anymore. It's just fun. It's a get-together. We sit, we talk, we share our books, and show off the socks we're knitting. Or the gardens we're gardening, in some cases, which is also really nice to get to see. The links to join, the Zoom asks you to register. That way I have your email address if something goes sideways. So that's the only reason I'm asking you to register. It asks you to register and then you'll get a link. It's the same link every week. So once you've registered, just save that link in your calendar and you'll be able to join whenever. To get that registration and all of the goodness, you can either go to craftlit.com/516 or 517, or you can go to the Facebook Craftlit group in the events section. I think it's listed in the calendar and it's the same set of links. None of it changes. Or you can search on the Craftlit group page. And I've linked out to that as well from the show notes. So there are many, many different ways that you can get to the Tuesday, Thursday links. And I've tried to give all of those ways to you in several different locations. So I hope to see you there because it really is. It's just so much fun for me to get to see you guys and to see what everybody's working on. And I hope it's as much fun for everybody who comes. They keep coming back. So I'm going to say it's working. Even my mom has shown up. Yeah, I know. That was pretty cool. Let's see. I've updated the mask information at heatherordover.com/masks. This is if you are interested in making masks. I am no longer making masks for our local healthcare professionals. Plenty of people have been donating and are much faster at mask making than I am. So now I'm making masks for people here who ask me for them because they have someone in the family who's immunocompromised. They just can't get the fit right on other masks, or they just want to know where the materials are coming from. So the reason I bring it up again is if you are going to make masks to donate, I really highly recommend including a tag on it, on the masks or on the bag of masks that says very specifically what kind of fabrics you're using, how many layers, if it's been pre-washed, if the fabric's been pre-washed, if you are sewing in an allergen-free home, and maybe mention that you wash your hands before you were sewing so that they know that this is as clean a thing as they could get. And if you do something like add a vacuum bag filter that you've pre-cut for the mask that you've made, make sure that they know to remove the filter before they send it through the washing machine. Let's see what else. If you're using 18 gauge wire for the nose bridge, I also highly recommend that you put on the tag to drip dry for as long as until it's damp, for a while, and then throw it through a gentle cycle. I'm finding that the 18 gauge wire in real heat of a hot dryer it's not so happy with the fabric thing. And I'm embedding it inside several different layers of fabric. It's still just not a very happy thing. So I have a sample of my mask tags also at heatherordover.com/masks. Oh, that's right. The last thing. It takes me several days to take the book recommendations and sometimes pattern recommendations from people on the Tuesday and Thursday chats. It takes me a little while to get all the links for you and all of that stuff, but I am regularly, semi-regularly, putting the lists of books and links up on the Facebook group page. Again, that's linked out to from the craftlit.com site. That's where you can get all the information. I'm also trying to add a little bit of description for you so that you have more than just a link to go off of, because we have stumbled across some really, really funny books right now. And I would like to share with you a couple of titles. I think last week I mentioned Andrea Vernon and the Corporation for Ultrahuman Protection, which is very Jasper Fordy and hysterically funny. So far, everybody who has taken the dive into that book has come up laughing. So if you need something silly, there's 2 books in that series so far. Then Anne Blanton also found the utterly uninteresting and unadventurous tales of Fred, the Vampire Accountant by Drew Hayes, and it's narrated by Kirby Hayborn. I am sold on the title alone. It's got 4 out of 5 stars and a little over 7,000 reviews, so that's 7 hours and 2 minutes of my life that will be spent laughing, I think, which sounds like a really good idea right now. Thing 2 has also figured out that he can listen to books and do things like cutting out fabric for the authentic 1865 ball gown that he is creating for his AP US History final. Even though we're in quarantine, he's making it for the smallest girl in the class, which is brilliant. We are figuring out how to get her the pieces so that she can try them on and then her mom can send pictures. But so far, Thing 2 has completed the chemise, complete with lace trim, and it looks quite nice. Today is getting the buttonholer to work. So prayers are accepted gratefully on that one. Okay, the Tenant of Wildfell Hall. Last week, I gave you a preview of what you had to look forward to. A little bit of Gilbert, a little bit of Helen. Today, we have a preface that Anne Brontë wrote when the book was republished. Now, Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Brontë standards was successful. The first run printed, I think, 500 copies. They sold half. She made £50. So that was great. She got really actually quite good reviews, but the reviews were interesting because they were both laudatory in that the writing was fresh and strong, articulate, unified. And then there were the criticisms that this is a horrible topic to have written about, and that surely people cannot be this bad. And if you're thinking, oh dear, why is Heather doing this to me? This sounds like I'm getting into Wuthering Heights, which is a book of bad behavior. No, I'm not. This is not Wuthering Heights. Anne is not Emily. Anne is not Charlotte. Anne, in fact, in several places, appears to be gently mocking Wuthering Heights, and also, to a certain extent, Jane Eyre, although she wrote Tenant of Wildfell Hall before Jane Eyre was written. Jane Eyre, however, was published first. So there's that reversal. But Charlotte had written and finished the book The Professor, which was her love letter to Monsieur Heger in Brussels, who had been her professor when she and Emily went to Brussels to learn French better so that they could come back and open their own school, which didn't ultimately happen. But as I said before, if you think you hear a joke or you think you hear something that is supposed to be amusing in this book, you are correct. I will also add, if you think you hear something that sounds biblical, I guarantee you it is. In the first chapter alone, I think we have 3 or 4 different Bible bombs that Anne drops just casually, expecting that you will know what she's talking about. And if something to me seems integral to understanding what's going on, I will make sure that I give you the biblical background so that you can get her sub-reference. If it's just kind of lightweight and she just tossed it in there because that's the way people talk, I may let it go. Otherwise, we could be here for days. But first, we are going to start with her preface to the second edition. I am going to play parts of it and then break in to point out interesting things that she's doing in the preface. Because if anyone was really paying attention, or I don't know if that's true, if anyone knew she was a woman, like read it knowing she was a woman, they would be able to tell that she is giving hints out that that is indeed true. She is female and a writer, and she's just an interesting person. So I'll let you decide for yourself. Here, let's listen to Maya Daguerre reading the opening preface to the second edition. And like I said, I'll break in and chat a little bit along the way.
Author's preface to the second edition. While I acknowledge the success of the present work to have been greater than I anticipated, and the praises it has elicited from a few kind critics to have been greater than it deserved, I must also admit that from some other quarters it has been censured with an asperity which I was little prepared to expect, and which my judgment, as well as my feelings, assures me is more bitter than just. It is scarcely the province of an author to refute the arguments of his censures and vindicate his own productions, but I may be allowed to make here a few observations with which I would have prefaced the first edition had I foreseen the necessity of such precautions against the misapprehensions of those who would read it with a prejudiced mind or be content to judge it by a hasty glance. My object in writing the following pages was not simply to amuse the reader, neither was it to gratify my own taste, nor yet to ingratiate myself with the press and the public. I wished to tell the truth. The truth always conveys its own moral to those who are able to receive it. But as the priceless treasure too frequently hides at the bottom of a well, it needs some courage to dive for it, especially as he that does so will be likely to incur more scorn and obloquy for the mud and water into which he has ventured to plunge, than thanks for the jewel that he procures, as in like manner she who will undertake the cleansing of a careless bachelor's apartment will be liable to more abuse for the dust she raises than commendation for the clearance she effects.
There is the first hint. Not hint. There's the first piece of evidence that we've been given that this writer is female. She does something really interesting here. She gives us 2 different versions of an analogy to understand her posit. What she posits is that the truth always conveys its own moral to those who are able to receive it. Now that's a biblical-ish allusion in and of itself. But then she goes on to give 2 illustrations of what she means. The first is this very poetic metaphor that somebody who's diving for a jewel in very muddy, mucky water is very likely to come up holding the jewel. And instead of having people say, wow, that's amazing, I can't believe that you did that, you're more likely to have people say, wow, go clean yourself, you filthy wretch, thereby proving that they have missed the whole point of what the attempt was. This happens to kids a lot, by the way, where they are trying to do something or fix something, and adults make assumptions about what their motive was instead of, asking to find out why'd you do that? Or what were you trying to do? And those misunderstandings can be things that kids remember for a really long time. So I'm thinking there may have been something in Anne's past that she's kind of getting at. But childhood scars aside, she does something else really interesting here, because her second metaphor is that of a woman cleaning a lazy bachelor's apartment. Okay, letting that sink in. Anne has worked as a governess in at least 2 households where the children were very spoiled. This is something she saw, to some extent, there. But she also has a brother who is the golden boy, and who there's some evidence, it's not huge, that he was happy to rely on the women of the family for doing things that he maybe didn't want to do so much. You're going to actually hear more to that effect, not in today's chapter, but soon, from one of the women in the book as well. But my point here is that we don't often get these kinds of analogies being made in literature, especially from this time period, from 1848. Just like when we did North and South and came across some descriptions of how they had improved their household to be more efficient for the women, it was one of those moments of revelation, like, oh my gosh, this is actually something that's been missing from most of the books that we've read, even ones that were written by women. I don't remember hearing a whole lot that's domestic, actually, in Jane Austen. You're going to hear more about it here. And we get that at least hinted at here in the opening preface. All right, we're going to get back to Maya. Here we go.
Let it not be imagined, however, that I consider myself competent to reform the errors and abuses of society, but only that I would fain contribute my humble quota towards so good an aim. And if I can gain the public ear at all, I would rather whisper a few wholesome truths therein than much soft nonsense. As the story of Agnes Grey was accused of extravagant over-colouring in those very parts that were carefully copied from the life with a most scrupulous avoidance of all exaggeration, so in the present work I find myself censured for depicting com amore, with a morbid love of the coarse, if not the brutal, those scenes which I will venture to say have not been more painful for the most fastidious of my critics to read than they were for me to describe.
So last week, I told the story of a particular scene in Agnes Grey that did get cited for its brutality. And here she says straight out that those parts that were most censured were the ones that were most carefully copied from real life. And she's making the connection that here, the places where she's being accused of portraying love as coarse and brutal, she's making it clear that wasn't fun to write. I didn't do that because it gave me giggles. I did that because it's real. And that seems to be where some of the critics got really upset, was the implication that this was not a fantasy story, that this was real, and whether it was a willful covering the ears and eyes and saying la 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 about domestic abuse, or whether it was real ignorance on the part of the male critics. I don't know. I don't know how generous we should be, but there is no question that Anne was using real life to write this book.
I may have gone too far, in which case I shall be careful not to trouble myself or my readers in the same way again. But when we have to do with vice and vicious characters, I maintain that it's better to depict them as they really are than as they would wish to appear. To represent a bad thing in its least offensive light is doubtless the most agreeable course for a writer of fiction to pursue. But is it the most honest or the safest? Is it better to reveal the snares and pitfalls of life to the young and thoughtless traveller, or cover them with branches and flowers? Oh, reader, if there were less of this delicate concealment of facts, this whispering peace, peace, when there is no peace, there will be less of sin and misery to the young of both sexes, who are left to wring their bitter knowledge from experience.
Her attitude here becomes very transparent during one particular section of the book. In fact, I thought that the subtitle to the entire series should be "Everything 13-year-old girls need to hear before they start dating," because Anne is she just does a really good job of that, of trying not to gloss over the problems that you might face if you don't pay attention to these specific things. And of course, she's also right that if she had written this less truthfully, we would be able to tell. It's just like if I was writing a book where a KKK, a Ku Klux Klan member was, and I had them saying something really nice about the African Americans who live down the street, probably that would not come across as particularly truthful, and you would stop reading the book. She is as honest as she can be.
I would not be understood to suppose that the proceedings of the unhappy scapegrace, with his few profligate companions I have here introduced, are a specimen of the common practices of society. The case is an extreme one, as I trusted none would fail to perceive, but I know that such characters do exist, and if I have warned one rash youth from following in their steps, or prevented one thoughtless girl from falling into the very natural error of my heroine, the book has not been written in vain. But at the same time, if any honest reader shall have derived more pain than pleasure from its perusal, and have closed the last volume with a disagreeable impression on his mind, I humbly crave his pardon, for such was far from my intention, and I will endeavour to do better another time, for I love to give innocent pleasure. Yet be it understood, I shall not limit my ambition to this, or even producing a perfect work of art. Time and talent so spent, I should consider wasted and misapplied. Such humble talents as God has given me, I will endeavour to put to their greatest use. If I am able to amuse, I will try to benefit too, and when I feel it my duty to speak an unpalatable truth, with the help of God I will speak it, though it be to the prejudice of my name and to the detriment of my reader's immediate pleasure, as well as my own. One word more, and I have done. Respecting the author's identity, I would have it to be distinctly understood that Acton Bell is neither Currier nor Ellis Bell, and therefore let not his faults be attributed to them.
It is not a mystery that these books were published under pseudonyms. Charlotte wrote under Currer Bell, Emily wrote under Ellis Bell, and Anne wrote under the name Acton Bell. That's probably not a surprise. What might be a surprise is that in the wake of Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights, and Agnes Grey being published right on the heels of each other, there were enough similarities in style, but certainly similarities in location, that made some very smart critics at the time posit that perhaps this was one author writing under different names, and maybe to do it to sell more books. So that is specifically what she is referring back to at this point. Not so much the pseudonymous aspect of the writer's identity, but the fact that they are not the same person.
As to whether the name be real or fictitious, it cannot greatly signify to those who know him only by his works. As little, I should think, can matter whether the writer so designated is a man or a woman, as one or two of my critics profess to have discovered. I take the imputation in good part, as a compliment to the just delineation of my female characters, and though I'm bound to attribute much of the severity of my censors to this suspicion, I make no effort to refute it, because in my own mind I'm satisfied that if a book is a good one, it is so, whatever the sex of the author may be. All novels are, or should be, written for both men and women to read, and I am at a loss to conceive how a man should permit himself to write anything that would be really disgraceful to a woman, or why a woman should be censored for writing anything that would be proper and becoming for a man. July 22nd, 1848.
And a little less than a year later, Anne Brontë was dead of tuberculosis. It's hard to believe that a woman who wrote that last bit about why it shouldn't matter whether a man wrote it or a woman wrote it could succumb to anything, but she did. And it's just awful, especially reading some of the biographies' descriptions of the fact that she knew she was on the way out for about a week or two before she actually passed away. It was probably 2 or 3 weeks, actually, because Branford had died, and then Emily died, and Anne had the same cough. So, duh. It's so sad. But I just love Aunt so much. Thank you, craft listener. I can't remember the name of who told me to do this book 10 years ago. I really appreciate it. All right. Sentimentality aside, this book is built on a framing device, much like several other books we have read. The most obvious, although it's also in some ways the most ponderous and confusing in the way that it attempts this, was Frankenstein. In Frankenstein, we have the guy on the ship being told the story of Victor and his creature. And then you have the internal story of the creature. So you have several layers, the diegetic levels, several layers of storytelling going on. In here, we have the same number of layers, but it's done much differently. And it interferes with the flow of the book much less than the beginning and end of Frankenstein do, I think. So in the beginning here, we have a letter to J. Halford, Esquire. And this letter comes from Gilbert Markham. And in this letter, you get some important exposition about characters and their relationships at the time of the end of the story. So it's kind of like with Treasure Island, how we had Jim telling us at the beginning of the book, I went on this adventure, and the people who went on the adventure with me, naming Trelawney and Livesey as people who told Jim to write down the story. That's all given to us at the beginning of the book. Therefore, we know that Jim, Trelawney, and Dr. Livesey all survive. So we can go into the book safely as a child or an adult reading the book to the child, that at least that part is going to wind up happy at the end. They're going to live. We have similar, though much less dire, information given to us in this preface. So I'm going to play this for you, and then we'll chat at the end before we jump into the main body of our story. Here we go with the little epistolary letter written opening to the book.
The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. Prologue. To J. Halford, Esquire. Dear Halford, when we were together last, you gave me a very particular and interesting account of the most remarkable occurrences of your early life, previous to our acquaintance, and then you requested a return of confidence from me. Not being in a storytelling humour at the time, I declined, under the plea of having nothing to tell, and the like shuffling excuses, which were regarded as wholly inadmissible by you. For though you instantly turned the conversation, it was with the air of an uncomplaining but deeply injured man, and your face was overshadowed with a cloud which darkened it to the end of our interview, and, for what I know, darkens it still. For your letters have ever since been distinguished by a certain dignified, semi-melancholy stiffness and reserve. That would have been very affecting, if my conscience accused me of deserving it. Are you not ashamed, old boy, at your age, and when we have known each other so intimately and so long, and when I have already given you so many proofs of frankness and confidence, and never resented your comparative closeness and taciturnity? But there it is, I suppose. You are not naturally communicative, and you thought you had done great things, and given an unparalleled proof of friendly confidence on that memorable occasion, which, doubtless, you have sworn shall be the last of the kind, and you deem that the smallest return I could make for so mighty a favour would be to follow your example without a moment's hesitation. Well, I did not take up the pen to reproach you, nor to defend myself, nor to apologise for past offences, but, if possible, to atone for them. It is a soaking, rainy day. The family are absent on a visit, and I am alone in my library, and I've been looking over certain musty old letters and papers, and musing on past times, so that I am now in a very proper frame of mind for amusing you with an old-world story. And, having withdrawn my well-roasted feet from the hobs, wheeled round to the table, and indited the above lines to my crusty old friend. I'm about to give him a sketch. No, not a sketch. A full and faithful account of certain circumstances connected with the most important event of my life, previous to my acquaintance with Jack Halford at least. And when you have read it, charge me with ingratitude and unfriendly reserve if you can. I know you like a long story, and are a great stickler for peculiarities and circumstantial details as my grandmother, so I will not spare you. My own patience and leisure shall be my only limits. Among the letters and papers I spoke of, there is a certain faded old journal of mine, which I mention by the way of assurance that I have not my memory alone, tenacious as it is, to depend upon, in order that your credulity may not be too severely taxed in following me through the minute details of my narrative. To begin then, at once, with chapter first, for it shall be a tale of many chapters.
All right, so that letter is not signed because the next chapter, chapter 1, is the rest of the letter. I found it very interesting. On the Gutenberg version of this book, this opening letter is nowhere to be found at all. And I think some people who have edited the book in the past have probably skipped it as well. But there's some really good information about Gilbert Markham in this letter and the way he writes it and the way he talks to his friend. He's kind of nudging his friend and insulting him several different times during the course of the letter, like my crusty old friend, and then just because I didn't feel like I was in the mood to tell you a big old story, now you've been holding it against me, and I can tell because the way you've been writing me letters is kind of tweaked, and I'm not here to apologize, and I'm not here to accuse. I am here to atone. I am going to tell you the story now. He is also letting us know that he's not telling us this story from memory, but that he's using a journal so that he has his memories intact in front of him so that he can give us a great amount of detail. Because without that information, the entire conceit of let me tell you a story becomes totally wacko. There's no way anybody's memory is as good as the detailed story that we are about to dive into. So this was Anne's way of sweeping out of our path any possible objection we might have to the reality, the veracity, the likelihood, the realness of what's to follow. And part of the reason, again, why I think this opening to the letter is often expunged from the text is because the very next words on the page, chapter 1, a discovery, are, "You must go back with me to the autumn of 1827. So direct address to somebody could be to us, the reader, could be to someone else. The answer to whom is this directed is given to us at the end of the chapter, where we have a signature, yours immutably, Gilbert Markham. So even if you didn't know it was a letter, if you had a copy of the book that only had chapter 1 and not the opening to the letter, you would have figured out by the end of chapter 1 that this was indeed a letter, an epistle from Gilbert. You would have figured out Halford's name, at least his last name, from the text. So, some things to know before we dive into chapter 1, because being a Brontë and this being 1848, there are some words that are being used kind of oddly and not exactly the way that we are used to using them now. There is the term surrout, S-U-R-O-U-T. This was a heavy top coat that a man would wear specific. It's kind of almost like an apron coat. It's something that you would wear if you were going to go out and work. It's not something that you would wear in possibly inclement weather if you were going out in a carriage or even riding in weather that might be questionable. This is more of a work top coat. The word dumpy sounds so negative, and it is slightly negative, but it's not the way we think of it today. It's a dumpling. It's a roundish figure, not so much a slovenly, flabby, flaccid kind of sounding word that we might think of it. The connotation is much more negative today than it was back then, is where I'm going. You are going to hear about somebody knitting in the book, and the description of how they knit and why is dead on. You're going to hear a reference to badger baiting. This is done for a couple of reasons. Badgers were evident and available. If you're really, really bored and the character who talks about badger baiting is really, really bored, it is supposed to be an extreme end. This is if you have to be crazy bored to go and actively sick dogs on a badger. Anne is not trying to get us to not like this character, but there is also no question that a level of casual brutality is evident in lots of places in this book. But this is not any kind of heavy foreboding, foreshadowing information about a character who's going to go bad. If you don't know about bear baiting, which was also popular at the time, although actually it was made illegal 10 years earlier to do bear baiting, where they would literally chain a bear up in a pit and then sick a bunch of dogs on the bear. Usually the bear won. You want the bear to win. Bears are expensive and hard to get into England at the time. So nobody wanted their bears killed, but that didn't mean they didn't want to rough them up a lot. So this was cruel not just to the bear, but to the dogs who did get killed by the bear, usually. I do link out to a history.com page where they actually have some sketches, which are not gruesome, but get the point across. So, badger baiting. That's that. Escutcheons. We've come across this before. These are the big shields that your family's heraldic symbols are going to be put upon and displayed. Aquiline. An aquiline nose, a Roman nose. Aquiline means eagle-like. It is that kind of nose, like an eagle's beak. At the time, an aquiline nose was considered very attractive and also a symbol of kind of a noble courage, often, because it goes back to the Roman thing. Interestingly enough, Anne Brontë had an aquiline nose, a chin that was short and a little bit recessed, and evidently really, really pretty eyes. So you're going to hear a description of a girl at one point, and the description is going to be really close to Anne Brontë, which is kind of fun. A retroussé nose is a nose that is turned up at the end. And the word that we tend to use right now for the colored part of our eye is an iris. You are going to hear irid, I-R-I-D, like iridescent. That term it fell out of favor for whatever reason, and irises took its place. You'll hear a reference to How Doth the Little Busy Bee. I have linked out to the poem for you if you've never heard it before. This was mocked brilliantly in Alice in Wonderland with How Doth the Little Crocodile. How Doth the Little Busy Bee is very much the idle hands are the devil's playground kind of thinking, and How Doth the Little Busy Bee was a poem that children often had to memorize to remember that really they should be doing something useful with their life. You will hear a reference to Eli and David and Absalom. Eli was a judge in the Bible who was way too lenient with his sons. I think they were his stepsons. They may have been wards of his. Anyway, he was raising them as his sons. He was way too lenient with them, and they turned out to be not such nice people. David's son, Absalom, was the golden boy. He was pretty. He was nice-ish. Everybody loved him. He was just the bomb. And then he killed his sister's rapist, who was his half-brother, I think. And he got busted for that. And he was unhappy, and his dad, David, was unhappy, and they had a big, massive falling out, and Absalom leaves. He is booted out of Jerusalem at that point, goes off in overtime, builds up his own army, and comes back to try and take over. Because remember, he is very charismatic. He's very much a leader that people enjoy following. He is killed in a battle trying to win the throne from his dad, David. And even though Absalom was a wayward child, David was a wreck when Absalom died, when he found out that Absalom died. So Eli, father of wayward children, David, father of wayward children, Absalom, the wayward child. It is a brief reference, but clearly these are rather extreme references where there is death and destruction caused by wayward children. You may hear when it is brought up in the text that that's a little over the top for a comparison to the children being described in the book. Abstemious is related to abstinence or abstaining. Abstemious is usually used when it's talking about food and drink. Slops, both is used as the word that we use it as, slop, like liquid grossness. There are slop bowls on a tea table at the time, so that if you didn't completely finish your cup of tea, well, no, let me back up. You wouldn't want to completely finish your cup of tea because there would be tea leaves at the bottom of your cup. So you would drink down until there was just a little bit of liquid left and the tea leaves. You'd swirl that around and then you'd dump it into the slop bowl, and then you'd get fresh hot tea out of the teapot. So a slop bowl was actually a thing at this time period. However, slops also referred to very weak or watery or unappealing food that was usually liquidy. If you think of Emma and her father was always trying to find the least interesting food to eat. It was always thin gruel or very, very watered down wine. Anything that had too much flavor in it was just way too much for him. You're going to hear the complete and utter opposite in a character in our first chapter. And the parallel that may come to mind between Emma's dad and this character is probably not an accident. All right, I think that's everything you need. Let's listen to the end of the letter that we just started. And here's Eden Ballantyne reading The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Brontë. Here we go.
The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, Volume 1, Chapter 1, A Discovery. You must go back with me to the autumn of 1827. My father, as you know, was a sort of gentleman farmer in Yorkshire, and I, by his express desire, succeeded him in the same quiet occupation. Not very willingly, for ambition urged me to higher aims, and self-conceit assured me that, in disregarding its voice, I was burying my talent in the earth and hiding my light under a bushel. My mother had done her utmost to persuade me that I was capable of great achievements, but my father, who thought ambition was the surest road to ruin, and change but another word for destruction, would listen to no schemes for bettering either my own condition or that of my fellow mortals. He assured me it was all rubbish, and exhorted me, with his dying breath, to continue in the good old ways, to follow his footsteps, and those of his fathers before him, and let my highest ambition be to walk honestly through the world, looking neither to my right hand nor my left, and to transmit the paternal acres to my children in at least as flourishing a condition as he left them to me. Well, an honest and industrious farmer is one of the most useful members of society, and if I devote my talent to the cultivation of my farm and the improvements of agriculture in general, I shall thereby benefit not only my own immediate connections and dependents, but in some degree mankind at large. Hence I shall not have lived in vain. With such reflections as these, I was endeavouring to console myself as I plodded home through the fields one cold, damp, cloudy evening towards the close of October. But the gleam of bright red fire through the parlour window had more effect in cheering my spirits and rebuking my thankless reapings than all the sage reflections and good resolutions I had forced my mind to frame. For I was young then, remember, only 24, and had not acquired half the rule of my own spirits that I now possess, trifling as that may be. However, that haven of bliss must not be entered till I had exchanged my miry boots for a clean pair of shoes and my rough surtout for a respectable coat, and made myself generally presentable before decent society. For my mother, with all her kindness, was vastly particular on certain points. In ascending to my room, I was met upon the stairs by a smart, pretty girl of 19, with a tidy, dumpy figure, a round face, bright, blooming cheeks, glossy, clustering curls, and merry brown eyes. I need not tell you, this was my sister Rose. She is, I know, a comely matron still, and doubtless no less lovely, in your eyes, than on the happy day you first beheld her. Nothing told me then that she, a few years hence, would be the wife to one entirely unknown to me as yet, but destined hereafter to become a closer friend than even herself, more intimate than that unmanly lad of 17, by whom I was collared in the passage on coming down, and nigh well jerked off my equilibrium, and who, in correction for his impudence, received a resounding whack on the sconce, which, however, sustained no serious injury from the infliction, as besides being more than commonly thick, it was protected by a redundant shock of short reddish curls, that my mother called auburn. On entering the parlour, we found that honoured lady seated in her armchair at the fireside, working away at her knitting, according to usual custom when she had nothing else to do. She had swept the hearth and made a bright blazing fire for our reception. The servant had just brought in the tea tray, and Rose was now producing the sugar basin and tea caddy from the cupboard in the black oak sideboard that shone like polished ebony in the cheerful parlour twilight. "Well, here you both are," cried my mother, looking round upon us without retarding the motion of her nimble fingers and glittering needles. "Now shut that door and come to the fire, while Rose gets the tea ready. I'm sure you must be starved. And tell me what you've been about all day. I like to know what my children have been about." "I've been breaking in the grey colt. No easy business, that. Directing the ploughing of the last wheat stubble, for the ploughboy has not the sense to direct himself, and carrying out a plan for the extensive and efficient draining of the low meadowlands." "That's my brave boy. And Fergus, what have you been doing?" "Badger baiting." And here he proceeded to give a particular account of his sport, and the respective traits of prowess evinced by the badger and the dogs, my mother pretending to listen with deep attention, and watching his animated countenance with a degree of maternal admiration I thought highly disproportionate to the object. "It's time you should be doing something else, Fergus," said I, as soon as a momentary pause in his narration allowed me to get a word in. "What can I do?" replied he. "My mother won't let me go to sea, or enter the army, and I'm determined to do nothing else, except make myself such a nuisance to you all that you'll be thankful to get rid of me on any terms." Our parent soothingly stroked his stiff, short curls. He growled and tried to look sulky. And then we all took our seats at the table, in obedience to the thrice-repeated summons of Rose. "Now take your tea," she said, "and I'll tell you what I've been doing. I've been to call on the Wilsons, and it's 1,000 pities you didn't go with me, Gilbert, for Eliza Millward was there." "Well, what of her?" "Oh, nothing. I'm not going to tell you about her. Only that she's a nice, amusing little thing when she isn't in a merry humour, and I shouldn't mind calling her." "Hush, hush, my dear, your brother has no such idea," whispered my mother, earnestly holding up her finger. "Well," resumed Rose, "I was going to tell you an important piece of news I heard there. I've been bursting with it ever since. You know, it was reported a month ago that someone was going to take Wildfell Hall, and what do you think? It has actually been inhabited above a week, and we never knew." "Impossible," cried my mother. "Preposterous," shrieked Fergus. "It has indeed,
by a single lady. Good gracious, my dear, the place is in ruins. She's had 2 or 3 rooms made habitable, and there she lives, all alone, except for an old woman for a servant. Oh dear, that spoils it. I hope she was a witch, observed Fergus, while carving an inch-thick slice of bread and butter. Nonsense, Fergus. Isn't it strange, Mamma? Strange? I can hardly believe it. But you may believe it, for Jane Wilson has seen her. She went with her mother, who, of course, when she heard of a stranger being in the neighbourhood, would be on pins and needles till she had seen her, and got all she could out of her. She is called Mrs. Graham, and she's in mourning. Not widow's weeds, but slightish mourning. And she's quite young, they say. Not above 5 or 26, but so reserved. They tried all they could to find out who she was and where she came from and all about her, but neither Mrs. Wilson, with her pernicious and impudent home thrust, nor Miss Wilson, with her skilful manoeuvring, could manage to elicit a single satisfactory answer, or even a casual remark or chance expression calculated to allay their curiosity, or throw the faintest ray of light upon her history, circumstance, or connections. Moreover, she was barely civil to them, and evidently better pleased to say goodbye than how do you do. But Eliza Millward says her father intends to call upon her soon to offer some pastoral advice, which he fears she needs, as, though she's known to have entered the neighbourhood early last week, she did not make her appearance at church on Sunday, and she, Eliza that is, will beg to accompany him, and is sure she can succeed in wheedling something out of her. You know, Gilbert, she can do anything. And we should call sometime, Mamma. It's only proper, you know. Of course, my dear. Poor thing. How lonely she must feel. And pray be quick about it, and mind bring back word of how much sugar she puts in her tea, and what sort of caps and aprons she wears, and all about it, for I don't know how I can live till I know, said Fergus very gravely. But if he intended the speech to be hailed as a master stroke of wit, he signally failed, for nobody laughed. However, he was not much disconcerted at that, for when he had taken a mouthful of bread and butter, and was about to swallow a gulp of tea, the humour of the thing burst upon him with such an irresistible force that he was obliged to jump up from the table and rush snorting and choking from the room, and after a minute was heard screaming in fearful agony in the garden. As for me, I was hungry, and contented myself with silently demolishing the tea, ham, and toast, while my mother and sister went on talking, and continued to discuss the apparent or non-apparent circumstances and probable or improbable history of this mysterious lady. But I must confess that, after my brother's misadventure, I once or twice raised the cup to my lips and put it down again without daring to taste the contents, lest I should injure my dignity by a similar explosion. The next day, my mother and Rose hastened to pay their compliments to the fair recluse, and came back but little wiser than they went, though my mother declared she did not regret the journey, for if she had not gained much good, she flattered herself she had imparted some, and that was better. She had given some useful advice, which she hoped would not be thrown away, for Mrs. Graham, though she said little to any purpose, and appeared somewhat self-opinionated, seemed not incapable of reflection, though she did not know where she had been all her life, poor thing, for she betrayed a lamentable ignorance in certain points, and had not even the sense to be ashamed of it. On what points, mother? Asked I. On household matters, and all the little niceties of cooking and such things that every lady ought to be familiar with, whether she be required to make practical use of her knowledge or not. I gave her some useful pieces of information, however, and several excellent receipts, the value of which she evidently could not appreciate, for she begged I would not trouble myself, as she lived in such a plain, quiet way, that she was sure she would never make use of them. No matter, dear, said I. It is what every respectable female ought to know. And besides, though you are alone now, you will not be always so. You have been married, and probably, I might say almost certainly, will be again. You are mistaken there, ma'am, she said, almost haughtily. I am certain I shall never. But I told her I knew better. Some romantic young widow, I suppose, said I, come there to end her days in solitude, and mourn in secret for the dear departed. But it won't last long." "No, I think not," observed Rose, "for she didn't seem very disconsolate after all. And she's excessively pretty, handsome, rather. You must see her, Gilbert. You will call her a perfect beauty, though you could hardly pretend to discover a resemblance between her and Eliza Millward." "Well, I can imagine many faces more beautiful than Eliza's, though not more charming. I allow she has a small claim to perfection, but then I maintain that if she were more perfect, she would be less interesting. So you prefer her faults to other people's perfections?" "Just so, saving my mother's presence." "Oh, my dear Gilbert, what nonsense you talk. I know you don't mean it. It's quite out of the question," said my mother, getting up and bustling out of the room under the pretence of household business, in order to escape the contradiction that was trembling on my tongue. After that, Rose favoured me with the further peculiars respecting Mrs. Graham. Her appearance, manners, and dress, and the very furniture of the room she inhabited, were all set before me, with a rather more clearness and precision than I cared to see them. But, as I was not a very attentive listener, I could not repeat the description if I would. The next day was Saturday, and on Sunday everybody wondered whether or not the fair unknown would profit by the vicar's remonstration and come to church. I confess, I looked with some interest myself towards the old family pew appertaining to Wildfell Hall, where the faded crimson cushions and lining had been unpressed and unrenewed for many years, and the grim escutcheons, with their lugubrious borders and rusty black cloth, frowned so sternly from the wall above. And there I beheld a tall, ladylike figure, clad in black, her face towards me, and there was something in it which, once seen, invited me to look again. Her hair was raven black, and disposed in long, glossy ringlets, a style of coiffure rather unusual in these days, but always graceful and becoming. Her complexion was clear and pale. Her eyes I could not see, for, being bent upon her prayer book, they were concealed by their drooping lids and long black lashes, but the brows above were expressive and well defined. The forehead was lofty and intellectual, the nose a perfect aquiline, and the features, in general, unexceptionable. Only there was a slight hollowness about the cheeks and eyes, and the lips. Though finely formed, they were a little too thin, a little too firmly compressed, and had something about them that betokened, I thought, no very soft or amiable temper. And I said in my heart, "I would rather admire you from this distance, fair lady, than be the partner of your home." Just then, she happened to raise her eyes, and they met mine. I did not choose to withdraw my gaze, and she turned again to her book, but with a momentary, indefinable expression of quiet scorn that was inexpressibly provoking to me. "She thinks me an impudent puppy," thought I. "Humph! She shall change her mind before long, if I think it worthwhile." But then it flashed upon me that these were very improper thoughts for a place of worship, and that my behaviour, on the present occasion, was anything but what it ought to be. Previous, however, to direct my mind to the service, I glanced round the church to see if anyone had been observing me. But no. All who were not attending to their prayer book were attending to the strange lady. My good mother and sister among the rest, and Mrs. Wilson and her daughter, and even Eliza Millward were slyly glancing from the corner of her eyes towards the object of general attraction. Then she glanced at me, simpering a little, and blushed, modestly looked at her prayer book, and endeavoured to compose her features. Here was I transgressing again, and this time I was made sensible of it by a sudden dig in the ribs from the elbow of my pert brother. For the present, I could only resent the insult by pressing my foot upon his toe, deferring further vengeance till we got out of the church. Now, Halford, before I close this letter, I'll tell you who Eliza Millward was. She was the vicar's younger daughter, and a very engaging little creature, for whom I felt no small degree of partiality, and she knew it, though I had never come out in any direct explanation, and had no definite intention of doing so. For my mother, maintained there was no one good enough for me within 20 miles round. Could not bear the thought of my marrying that insignificant little thing, who, in addition to her numerous other disqualifications, had not £20 to call her own. Eliza's figure was at once slight and plump, her small face, and nearly as round as my sister's, complexion something similar to hers, but more delicate and less decidedly blooming. Nose, retroussé, features generally irregular and altogether. She was rather charming than pretty. But her eyes, I must not forget those remarkable features, for herein her chief attraction lay, an outward aspect at least. They were long and narrow in shape, the idrids black or very dark brown, the expression various and ever-changing, but always either preternaturally, I had almost said diabolically wicked, or irresistibly bewitching. Often both. Her voice was gentle and childish, her tread light and soft as that of a cat, but her manners more frequently resembled those of a pretty, playful kitten that is now pert and roguish, now timid and demure, according to its own sweet will. Her sister Mary was several years older, several inches taller, and of a large, coarser build, a plain, quiet, sensible girl, who had patiently nursed their mother through the last long, tedious illness, and had been housekeeper and family drudge, and thence to the present time. She was trusted and valued by her father, loved and courted by all dogs, cats, children, and poor people, and slighted and neglected by everyone else. The Reverend Michael Millward himself was a tall, ponderous, elderly gentleman, who placed a shovel hat above his large, square, massive-featured face, carried a stout walking-stick in his hand, and encased his powerful limbs in knee-breeches and gaiters, or black silk stockings on state occasions. He was a man of fixed principles, strong prejudice, and regular habits, intolerant of dissent in any shape, acting under firm conviction that his opinions were always right, and whoever differed from them must be either deplorably ignorant or wilfully blind. In childhood, I had always been accustomed to regard him with a feeling of reverential awe, but lately, even now, surmounted, for though he had a fatherly kindness for the well-behaved, he was a strict disciplinarian, and often sternly reproved our juvenile failings and peccadilloes. And moreover, in those days, whenever he called upon our parents, we had to stand before him and say our catechisms, or repeat, "How doth the little buzzy bee?" or some other hymn, or, worse than all, be questioned about his latest text, and the heads of the discourse, which we could never remember. Sometimes the worthy gentleman would reprove my mother for being over-indulgent to her sons, with a reference to old Eli, or David and Absalom, which was particularly galling to her feelings, and very highly as she respected him and all his sayings. I once heard her exclaim, "I wish to goodness he had a son himself. He wouldn't be so ready with his advice to other people then. He'd see what it was like to have a couple of boys to keep in order." He had a laudable care for his own bodily health, kept very early hours, regularly took a walk before breakfast, and vastly particular about warm and dry clothing, had never been known to preach a sermon without previously swallowing a raw egg. Albeit he was gifted with good lungs and a powerful voice, and was generally extremely particular about what he ate and drank, though by no means abstemious, and having a mode of dietary peculiar to himself, being a great despiser of tea and such slops, and a patron of malt liquors, bacon and eggs, ham, hung beef, and other strong meats, which agreed well enough with his digestive organs, and therefore were maintained by him to be good and wholesome for everybody, and confidently recommended to the most delicate convalescents or dyspeptics, who, if they failed to derive the promised benefits from his prescriptions, were told it was because they had not persevered, and if they complained of inconvenient results therefrom, were assured it was all fancy. I will just touch upon two other persons whom I've mentioned, and then bring this long letter to a close. These are Mrs. Wilson and her daughter. The former was the widow of a substantial farmer, a narrow-minded, tattling old gossip, whose character is not worth describing. She had 2 sons, Robert, a rough countrified farmer, and Richard, a retiring, studious young man who was studying the classics with the vicar's assistant, preparing for college, with a view to entering the church. Their sister Jane was a young lady of some talent and more ambition. She had, at her own desire, received a regular boarding school education, superior to what any member of the family had obtained before. She had taken the polish well, acquired considerable elegance of manner, quite lost her provincial accent, and could boast more accomplishment than the vicar's daughter. She was considered a beauty besides, but never for a moment could she number me amongst her admirers. She was about 26, rather tall and very slender. Her hair was neither chestnut nor auburn, but a most decided, bright, light red. Her complexion was remarkably fair and brilliant. Her head small, neck long, chin well turned, but very short lips, thin and red. Eyes clear hazel, quick and penetrating, but entirely destitute of poetry or feeling. She had, or might have had, many suitors in her own rank of life, but scornfully repulsed or rejected them all, for none but a gentleman could please her refined taste, and none but a rich one could satisfy her soaring ambition. One gentleman there was, from whom she had lately received some rather pointed attention, and upon whose heart, name, and fortune it was whispered she had serious designs. This was Mr. Lawrence, a young squire whose family had formerly occupied Wildfell Hall, but had deserted it some 15 years ago for a more modern and commodious mansion in the neighbouring parish. Now, Halford, I bid you adieu for the present. This is the first instalment of my debt. If the coin suits you, tell me so, and I'll send you the rest at my leisure. If you would rather remain my creditor than stuff your purse with such ungainly, heavy pieces, tell me still, and I'll pardon your bad taste, and willingly keep the treasure to myself. Yours, immutably, Gilbert Markham.
All right. We have a lot of information about people. Just so you know, I started trying to create a flowchart, some kind of larger village family tree of all of these people. I will be sharing chunks of it as we go along in chapters where it's been a while since we've heard of these people, so this will jog your memory. So I get it. There's also a problem that happened for me, at least, in Wuthering Heights, and happened for me again here. And that is that Anne and Emily really like names that start with the letter H. There's Hareton in Wuthering Heights and Heathcliff. It's too many H's. You're going to get the same thing here. So the girl names, Rose, Eliza, Jane, all stand out. Fergus and Gilbert, they stand out. But once we expand our view a little bit, there's a lot of H's coming. So yeah, I'll do my best to help with keeping everybody straight. But we have some important things to know. First, it might not have been apparent in the beginning when we heard the preface to the letter, because it sounds very much like a gentleman of the time writing to a friend. He sounds like he is of the leisure class in general, the way he talks about where he is and what he's doing, and clearly he has enough time to write down this enormous story. However, we find out here, and this is very important, that Gilbert Markham is a gentleman farmer. He's a farmer. His father has left him the farm. He's the oldest son of 3 children. And his mom thinks he's the mom. His mom is also putting interesting and unfortunate restrictions on his brother Fergus. But either way, it's clear from the writing that Gilbert has some education. He also tells us pretty soon after he starts that he was only 24 at this time and had not acquired half the rule over my own spirit that I now possess, trifling as that may be. So we've already seen that Gilbert can be a little tweaky, a little snarky in the way he deals with his friends, but that he does generally come back to a place of good nature and good humor. And here we get this recognition that he was young, and sometimes that means stupid too, and that he did in fact grow up. And part of growing up is recognizing that, okay, maybe I don't have all the control over myself that I'd like to think I would by this age, but it's more than I had when I was 24. Okay. So there is some good humor and some self-awareness in this man, and that is really important. We also see his relationship with Fergus, which truly cracked me up the first time I read the book, because they're smacking each other around all the time and stepping on each other's toes in church and doing things that actual brothers do. And I don't remember seeing anything like that in any other book of this era. Just the fact that Fergus, while he's eating his bread and about to take a cup of tea, it strikes him as really, really funny what he had just said, and inhales and chokes on the chunk of bread and maybe some tea, and has to leave the room because he's coughing so loudly and in real pain. I've never seen anything like that in a book either. Fergus just cracks me up. I like Fergus a lot. And while his mother is restricting him, and he says, he's not old enough to inherit property, and his mom won't let him go to sea or to the army. And let's just state right here, he doesn't seem to be particularly well suited to the clergy either. His mom may not be wrong in not letting him go into the army or the navy. He doesn't seem particularly disciplined, but he is fun, and he's kind of comic relief, but he also gives Gilbert another male in the room to work off of, and Rose another male in the room to work off of. Rose is very much teasing her brother Gilbert about this girl Eliza, and their mom is totally playing along with it. And just to refresh your memory, Eliza Millward, her dad is the vicar, Michael Millward, who is our opposite of Emma's father, Mr. Woodhouse. We also get Jane Wilson. The Wilsons will figure more in the book as well. And we have this wonderful split between the mom having been so happy to have gone to see this new Mrs. Graham and to give her some pieces of really useful advice that every woman should know. How she doesn't think Mrs. Graham knows it, I don't know, but she clearly didn't ask. And then later in the chapter, she gets irked because the vicar is giving her advice over how to raise boys. And her response is, it'd be great to get advice from him if he'd ever had a boy. Which, again, real people act like this. Real people are just as blind to their foibles as these people are. And Anne does a great job of putting it out there and letting it be funny and not hitting us over the head with it, I think. So that's fun. And there were several instances of both good and bad Gilbert in this. Good Gilbert. If Eliza Millward were more perfect, she would be less interesting. That's an amazing statement to get from a man in this time period, and not one that I think is just Anne being hopeful for her future. She did get to know some men in lots of different contexts through her work and travel and school also. She also read a ton. But this is not a Byronic hero statement. This is not a romantic lead statement necessarily. This is an interesting guy. But then bad Gilbert, we see, he plays his mother like a cheap violin, and also says out loud all of these lovely things about his mother being perfect and all of that. So he's definitely playing her. And there's also another good Gilbert where he recognizes that he's not thinking about the things that he should be thinking about in church. Now, whether he manages to change that is a completely other thing, but the recognition of the fault is interesting, and the fault is absolutely perfectly human and understandable. I thought it was kind of cool that the mom isn't into Eliza. Eliza Millwood, who Gilbert apparently likes, Mom's not so into her. That could just be nobody's good enough for my boy, or it could be something else. The description of Eliza Millward's older sister as the family drudge, she struck me as a little bit Miss Bates-like, but less silly. And the line, she's valued and trusted by her father, and animals all love her, but she is slighted and neglected by everyone else, just killed me. And it's like an inverted, like Water for Chocolate moment. She was the oldest, so she was the one who had to take care of their mother when she got sick, instead of like Water for Chocolate, where it's the youngest. It's just sad. It's sad, and you know it's also real. And we get our first intimations of Wildfell Hall. There's Guy, Mr. Lawrence. His family left Wildfell Hall 15 years ago, so it's pretty much been laying fallow and empty for 15 years, which the way that it is discussed and described is so matter-of-fact and so not awe-inspiring. This is one of those moments where I get the sense that Anne's like, all right, I've listened to Emily's description of the houses in Wuthering Heights, and I'm going completely the opposite direction. There is nothing mysterious about the house. Pay no attention to the house. Yeah, it's called the Tenant of Wildfell Hall. The house, not mysterious, not really interesting. It's big and old and done. So she's being very matter-of-fact about the whole thing. And that sets us up for chapter 2, which we will have next week. Oh, I hope you enjoyed the beginning of the book. I know nothing hugely interesting happens, but we do get a lot of information about the people, and we learn a little bit about how the neighborhood works when it comes to brand new neighbors and things like that. And also the fact that people like Fergus absolutely recognize how ridiculous it is that everybody absolutely must know everything they can possibly find out about the new Mrs. Graham. What cap does she wear? How long are her eyelashes? All sorts of silliness. All right. Have a great week. I will talk to you soon. Take care. Bye. A big thanks to all the Craftlit listeners who support the show by being a premium audio member via craftlit.com/premium or via patreon.com/craftlit. Your support for the show is what's kept us going since 2006. If you feel like getting free audio pretty much every week, please consider supporting the show by heading over to patreon.com/craftlit and pledging what you feel the show is worth to you. If you can't support the show that way, consider leaving a review at iTunes or at our facebook.com/craftlit page, or follow @craftlit on Twitter and share the show with your followers too. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on.